At Dark and Twisties, we know that people don't particularly like the episodes that contain banter.
So for those who prefer a more serious telling of a story, we bring you a Dark and Twisties mini. The following may contain graphic content, so listener discretion is advised. I'm Melissa.
And I'm Amanda.
And this is Dark and Twisty Minis.
Yeah, but you're all dark and twisty inside.
Dark and twisty.
I'm not happy and bubbly. I'm dark and cloudy.
Are you having the dark and twisties?
We are not happy, glowy people.
Yeah.
Both of you are dark and twisty.
Because you're the only one who knows me. Darkly. Really knows me.
If I murdered someone, she's the person I'd call to help me drag the corpse across the living room floor.
Are you and Christine in a dark and twisty place?
Are you in the dark place?
Yeah.
Me too.
This is the story of LaVena Lynn Johnson. In the early hours of July 19, 2005, 19-year-old Private First Class LaVena Johnson was found dead inside of a contractor's tent on a military base in Balad, Iraq. Hours later, her parents receive a knock at the door informing them that their oldest daughter had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The family was confused by this considering they had just recently spoke with LaVena, and she seemed normal and excited about her upcoming leave rotation allowing her to visit family for Christmas. She was happy and healthy and spoke with them often as she was working in the communications department, and they could not see how she could have taken her own life.
The Army recommended that the family have a closed casket funeral due to the condition of the body, but the Johnsons declined. Having an open casket meant the Johnsons could see their daughter one last time, but what they saw instead was discrepancies with the Army's story of how LaVena died. While watching his daughter's body be prepared for her funeral, Dr. Johnson noticed LaVena's body had a lot of trauma to it. Her nose appears to be broken, she had black eyes, along with some of her teeth having been knocked out. It looked as though she was beaten. Not only that, but the alleged self-inflicted gunshot wound was on the side of her head and did not appear to be from an M16 rifle. He requested that once the autopsy was done, for the medical examiner to contact him so they could go over his findings.
The Johnson family waited almost 2 weeks before the autopsy results were completed and he was contacted. He was advised that no rape kit was performed, along with no fingernail scrapings due to no signs of sexual assault or struggle, and when questioned about the size and the location of the gunshot wound, the medical examiner claimed it was an exit wound on the left side of her head from a rifle being inside of her mouth, even though she was right-handed and her arms weren't long enough to pull the trigger on a 40-inch weapon. Dr. Johnson decided to request a copy of the autopsy report in hopes of searching for answers, but all he found was more questions.
When he received the Army and medical examiner's report, they included black and white Xerox copies of crime scene photos and a picture of a CD-ROM, along with witness statements made during the Army's initial investigation. From the photos, LaVena was laying flat on her back with her right hand over her face. The M16 was near her body, but between them was a sleeping cot and her body was underneath a bench. Through witness statements and medical records, he also learned that LaVena had recently been sexually assaulted and was undergoing medical treatment for a sexually transmitted infection before her death. When the Johnson family decided to question the Army about the inconsistencies, they found out that they marked LaVena's death as a combat-related fatality, even though her position was considered a support role and she would have most likely never seen combat, which left the family with even more questions. The Army then stated that LaVena had recently been showing signs of depression over a recent breakup and that friends of LaVena's had alleged that she was talking about it weeks prior to her death.
According to the Army's investigation, on the evening of July 18th, LaVena left for work, stopped at the military post exchange store, and then headed to her tent. She then took pages from her journal, printed out emails and her M16 rifle, and headed to a nearby contractor's tent. Once she got inside, she used a can of accelerant to start a fire to burn the letters in the emails, and then shot herself in the mouth with the rifle. Witnesses who heard the gunshot found the tent on fire along with LaVena's body inside under a bench, and it was clear she was dead. He saw the M16 lying across her body, and everything, including parts of her body, were on fire. He then called for an ambulance and secured the scene.
The Johnsons asked if they could get a copy of the CD-ROM they saw pictured in LaVena's evidence file, but they were denied due to the fact that it would violate the privacy of the third-party names included on it. With no budging from the military on obtaining records involved in his daughter's death, Dr. Johnson decided to meet with members of Congress for help in hopes of forcing the Army to hand over a copy of what was contained on the CD. The United States Army was then ordered to turn the CD-ROM over to the Johnson family, and the contents would start to prove the Johnsons were right all along.
Located on the CD-ROM was all of the original colored crime scene photos that showed something far from suicide. There was photographs of bloody footprints in the front of the tent not included in the first report. Along with it, it appeared that her neck was broken and lividity had set in on her left side. Also photoed was acid burns on her inner thighs and her right hand, scratch marks, teeth imprints on her upper body, along with massive bruises on her body. There was evidence that something had been shoved inside of her, indicating a sexual assault, prompting the Johnson family to have LaVena's body exhumed and a new autopsy performed by a third party.
During the second autopsy, it was determined that her body showed signs of a brutal sexual assault and that parts of her vagina had been surgically removed. They found evidence of a corrosive-type liquid on her genitals likely to be used to hide DNA evidence, along with burns and bruises on her face and body. It was confirmed that her neck and nose were broken, and the gunshot wound was also inconsistent with suicide, and the exit wound resembled a 9mm pistol and not an M16 rifle. The gloves she was wearing had been glued to her hands, but no gunshot residue was found, indicating that she had not pulled the trigger with those gloves on.
With LaVena's second autopsy bringing to light far more evidence that was left out during the initial autopsy, Dr. Johnson hopes to have LaVena's case reopened, but was continuously denied, leaving him asking for the public's help. Using the media to hopefully push the investigation to be considered for review, petitions were created and sent to members of Congress, including the House of Armed Services Committee, in hopes of gaining some attention. The United States Army Criminal Investigation Command released a statement on the PFC LaVena Johnson investigation stating, "We express our sincere condolences to the family and friends of PFC LaVena Johnson. We have and continue to take the death of PFC Johnson very seriously, and if any new credible information to this case was to surface, we would immediately reopen the investigation." They also state that the investigation done by the military was lengthy and thorough, and it was done by highly trained special agents that faced their findings on the testimony, physical, and forensic evidence.
Cheryl McCollum at the Cold Case Investigative Research Institute agreed to review LaVena's case in 2011 at the request of the Johnsons. After spending nearly 3 years going over the evidence, they were unable to confirm or disprove the military's report on LaVena's death, stating there was nothing about this case that we could go back to the Army to say you need to relook at.
The Johnson family believes that LaVena was assaulted and murdered. The person who most likely did this was a well-ranked military member or close to one, because he believes that LaVena's body was then mutilated, redressed, and set on fire to destroy any evidence. There was no way that LaVena could position a rifle in her mouth and pull the trigger had she just poured flammable substance and burnt her hands, nor were her arms long enough. If the weapon she used was an M16 rifle, why was the exit wound a 9mm pistol? There was no suicide note, along with no recovered bullet from the scene. Unreleased evidence contained on the CD that was not sent in the initial report proves that this case deserves to be reopened, and lack of cooperation from the military supports it.
My daughter was beaten, raped, murdered, set on fire, and then tried to burn her tent down with her body in it. And your evidence says that. So it will be a cold day in hell before I stop, and I mean that with all my heart. A direct quote from Dr. John Johnson.
16 years later, LaVena Johnson's case is still closed and classified as a suicide.